Welcome to Awake Us Now. Today's program is sponsored by Awake Us Now. And now, here's Pastor Dodge.
What I'd like to do is just refresh your memory as we had started looking at Matthew 24, the opening verses of that chapter. Jesus had warned his disciples about deception. Make sure that no one deceives you. And he emphasized that deception repeatedly. He talks about war and rumors of war and earthquakes and famines, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. He talks about persecution against his followers and them even being put to death because of their testimony to him. He warns about false prophets. And he speaks also about worldwide evangelization, that this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout all the nations as a testimony, and then the end will come. But in the midst of all of that, he also talks about great tribulation, the tribulation of those days. And as we discussed last week, the term that Matthew uses, two words in the Greek, are the same words that are used in the book of Revelation to talk about the great tribulation. And as we mentioned last time, it seems to refer to the entire period after Jesus' death and resurrection until his final return. This is the great tribulation that we are in now. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be an especially ramped up time before the end. But the Bible makes it very clear that we have been living in a time of great tribulation ever since the resurrection of Christ and his ascension into heaven. And so it's on that note that we pick up where we left off last time, Matthew 24, verse 29, where we read these words. Jesus says, "Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken." Now, today, many people look at this and they say, this seems to be talking about cosmic signs, and that certainly may well be the case. I would remind you, however, that in the period of the first century, the time of Jesus and the apostles, these kinds of signs, the sun, the moon, the stars, were seen as objects of worship by pagans. And what this could also mean is that paganism itself is going to be challenged and broken down because of all that Jesus is doing and because of his imminent return. Either way, it works. My guess is it's probably all of the above. Oftentimes we want to say, well, is it this or that? And so often the answer is yes. And Jesus goes on. He says, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven." Now, what is that sign? Many early believers in the first couple of centuries suggested that it would be the sign of the cross in the sky, although there's nothing in the scripture to indicate that. What follows, though, is in all likelihood the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and with great glory. The sign seems to be the return of Jesus, his second coming. And when it speaks of him coming on the clouds, those are words that are used also elsewhere in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, it's a fascinating, fascinating verse. Keep in mind, Jesus gave this revelation to his best friend and disciple, John. And this is what John was told. "Look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all peoples on earth will mourn because of him." Those words from Revelation 1:7 are taken lock, stock, and barrel out of the Old Testament. In the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 13, it talks about one like a son of man who is coming with the clouds. Same language. And every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all peoples on earth will mourn because of him. It's taken right out of Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. Zechariah says that everyone is going to look on the one whom they have pierced, and they will mourn over him, Zechariah says, like they mourn over a firstborn son. Jesus is the firstborn. He is the one to whom The inheritance is given. He is the very Son of the living God. And that is what Zechariah had predicted hundreds of years before the coming of Christ. And now, as Jesus speaks these words, he is speaking to devout Jewish followers who are thoroughly familiar with the Old Testament scriptures, with the Hebrew scriptures. And they realize, and will come to realize more and more, that everything written there refers to him. Well, Matthew goes on. Matthew tells us Jesus then said this, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather the elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. In other words, when Jesus returns, no one is going to have to wonder, do you think this is the second coming of Christ? We won't need to run a series of polls indicating what percent of young adults believe that it is the second coming of Christ, as opposed to that percentage of older adults who believe it. Everyone's going to know. And the words that Jesus uses, he will send his angels. Now keep in mind, we're told he will be coming with the clouds. In the Hebrew scriptures, the clouds are often used to describe the coming of angels, the angelic host. And so he's sending his angels with a loud trumpet call, with the loud shofar, the blowing of the ram's horn. You will recall that when God gave the covenant to Israel at Mount Sinai, before he gave them the Ten Commandments, we are told there was the loud blast of what sounded like a trumpet that got louder and louder, and the people were petrified. In fact, ultimately they would say, Moses, you talk to God. It is too frightening to speak to the living God. And what Jesus is saying is, when he returns, so does the trumpet call. And by the way, New Testament authors mention the same thing. The Apostle Paul, in his writings to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15, talks about the trumpet call, about the last trumpet, and the trumpet will sound and the dead will be raised, Paul writes. He writes to the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 16, and he says that the trumpet will sound and the dead will be raised. It's language that the followers of Jesus take directly from Jesus himself. Well, at this point, I'd like to circle back now. We've gone through the opening words of Jesus in answer to the question, when will the temple be destroyed and what will be the sign of your second coming? But last week, we didn't go into the whole story about what is perhaps the most controversial and difficult section of this teaching. And that revolves around the question, what is the abomination that causes desolation? We'd talked briefly about that last time. I'd like to spend far more time here today. And so we're going to circle back to Matthew 24, verse 15, where Jesus spoke these words to his disciples. He said, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation. And again, as we talked last time, that's taken right out of Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9, which talks about the coming of the Messiah being killed, and the temple being destroyed. Jesus says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation spoken through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. And the question is, understand what? Obviously, even as Jesus was speaking these words, and as the earliest disciples like Matthew were writing down his words, Mark the same way, they recognize this is a perplexing statement and you need to think this one through. Almost 2,000 years later, we're still trying to think it through. But let's take a look at some of the suggestions that have been made, and many of them, if not all of them, are indeed fulfilled or will be fulfilled. So let's take a look. Again, Matthew 24, verse 15, let the reader understand. The first thing, the natural thing that a Jewish person would have thought of when they thought about the abomination that causes desolation, as mentioned by Daniel, they would have immediately thought back almost 200 years earlier in their history. Because in the year 167 BC, the Syrian king Antiochus IV Epiphanes conquered Jerusalem, desecrated the temple, and did that in the following way. He built an altar to Zeus, and in the temple he offered up unclean animals, including a pig, which is about as unclean as it gets for someone who is eating kosher. Sacrifices a pig in the temple complex, desecrates the temple sanctuary itself, and it led to a great revolt. In fact, it was a revolt led by a group of priests known as the Maccabees. And by the way, if you're familiar with the Maccabees Insurance Company, that's where the name comes from. The Maccabees threw out the Syrians, cleansed the temple. And when Jewish people of Jesus' day would hear the desolation or the abomination rather that causes desolation, this is immediately what they would have thought of. But keep in mind, it was in the past. And Jesus is saying, there's another one coming. So, what may be the other one? Well, some have suggested that this refers to an event that didn't take place, but that probably caused many to think, oh no, it's happening again. And it goes back to the time of Gaius Caligula, the Roman emperor, who is known as being an absolute disaster. But Gaius Caligula, in the year 40 AD, gave an order that a gigantic statue of himself be transported to Jerusalem and set up in the temple at Jerusalem. Can you imagine what that would have cost? The Jewish revolt would have occurred about 30 years earlier than it actually did, because this would be an abomination that causes desolation, as great as Antiochus's, maybe even more so. Fortunately, Gaius died before the event could be carried out. In fact, a Roman governor who had written and said, you can't do this, it'll just lead to disaster. The governor was given, a letter was sent by Gaius to the governor saying, kill yourself. Fortunately for the governor, word got to him that Gaius had already died before the letter arrived. It was lost in the mail for a little while. Many have said maybe that was why it is written, let the reader understand. In other words, this wasn't the abomination. Looked like it might be, but it didn't come to fulfillment. Another possibility is during the revolt against Rome. Most likely in the winter of 67-68 AD. We don't know a lot about it, but we do know it truly was an abomination that causes desolation, and it was actually carried out by Jewish people. Here's the story. It's related not in the New Testament, but in the writings of the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. This is what Josephus writes about what the Zealots did in the winter of 67-68 AD. He says, at last the people were ready for rebellion against the Zealots, instigated by Ananus, the eldest of the chief priests. The Zealots had taken refuge in the temple of God and turned it into a fortress, making the holy place their headquarters. They pretended that, according to ancient law, the high priest could be chosen by lot, although the succession, was hereditary. Casting lots, the office fell on a coarse clown named Phani, who scarcely knew what the high priesthood meant, yet they dressed him in the sacred vestments and taught him how to act. This shocking impiety, which to them was a subject of merriment, drew tears from the other priests, who grieved over this mockery of their law. Such an outrage was more than the people could stand. And it may well be that is when believers in the city of Jerusalem fled, when they saw that desolation, that abomination, they would have fled. We talked last time also that the time of the Roman siege and the Romans setting up their sacred banners would have been an abomination in Jewish eyes. But there is another possibility as well. I fully believe that all of these either were or could be abominations that cause desolation. I lean toward the zealots in the winter as the one that Jesus is talking about in the lifetime of the disciples, but I'm open to other views, and I recognize we can't say for certain. But there is something else, and that is, as we have seen throughout the Bible, there are certain events and activities that occur on a semi-regular basis. God intervenes to save his people. His people rejoice, and then they turn away from him, and they bring judgment on themselves. And God steps in to save them, and his people rejoice, and then they turn away from him, and it brings judgment on them, and then he comes to rescue them. When it comes to the abomination that causes desolation, there's no denying that what Antiochus Epiphanes did was an abomination that causes desolation. There is no denying if Gaius Caligula had set up his statue in the temple, it would have been an abomination that causes desolation. There's no denying that what the Zealots did in the winter of 67-68 AD was an abomination that causes desolation. And the Romans, certainly during and after their siege, they committed an abomination that causes desolation. They destroyed the temple, burned it down, tore stone apart from every stone, just as Jesus had predicted. But there's also the very real possibility that this refers as well to a future event. We don't know. But the day may well come when all of a sudden the reader will understand in these last days and realize, and this is also what Jesus was talking about. Today, there are many people who have tried to figure out how all the pieces are going to fall into place. I will stress, as we're going to see, Jesus warned us we can't know those things. We can recognize the seasons because he says when you see these things happening, look up, your redemption draws nigh. But those seasons have also been seen throughout the Christian era. And today, we see many of those signs, as we mentioned last week, in even greater measure than in previous centuries. But ultimately, Jesus is the one who tells us this. He says, Matthew 24, verses 32 and 33, "Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door." And as Jesus speaks that, I believe once again he is speaking to the two things that the disciples had asked. They would be able, when they see the signs taking place, to recognize the destruction of the temple is coming soon. And you and I can also look at the signs that Jesus mentioned and realize he's coming back. And he's coming soon. By the way, the word that is sometimes translated soon from the book of Revelation can also mean quickly. And I think that's well worth keeping in mind as well. Well, Jesus goes on and he says, verse 34, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." And here again, the question is, what does Jesus mean when he says this generation? Now, many critics of the Christian faith have said, obviously, Jesus got it wrong, because he apparently taught that the end of the world would come in the lifetime of the generation that was alive when he was speaking and teaching. And again, I would just emphasize what we saw last week. as Jesus talks about the signs of the temple's destruction, but also the signs of the times prior to his returning, all of those things did happen within the lifetime of those early disciples. But there is another possibility as far as understanding this, and that is that this generation refers to a specific group of people. This generation is sometimes used as code for the Jewish people. All sorts of individuals have tried to destroy the Jewish nation and destroy the Jewish people. It goes all the way back. Well, it goes all the way back to Pharaoh. It goes all the way back to what the Jewish people experienced during their exile, during the attack, for instance, of the Babylonians, what they experienced when the Assyrians came down on the northern kingdom, what they experienced at the hand of the Romans, what they experienced during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, what they experienced, I am embarrassed to say, at the hand of people who professed to be Christian in many of the centuries, what they experienced at the hand of the czars and the communists and the Nazis. Throughout history, the devil has always sought to destroy the Jewish people. And it may well be what Jesus is saying is, in spite of the adversary's plans, they will continue until he returns. And he will return when they say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's continue on. Now Jesus says, and here we go to the defining words that tell us we're not going to be able to figure this out ahead of time. Jesus says, "But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." And keep in mind, the Apostle Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2 that although Jesus was in very nature God, he did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but he emptied himself, took on the form of a servant, and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross. Jesus, as the Son of God in the flesh, willingly set aside some of the rights and privileges that he has as God. And as Jesus is speaking to his disciples, he says, no one knows that day. Not the angels. I don't even know it. Only the Father. And then he goes on to say this, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. In other words, what Jesus is saying is what the New Testament authors tell us. God once judged the world by water. The next time, he will judge it by fire. That is what Jesus taught. It's what the Apostle Peter taught. It's what Jude taught. It's what Revelation teaches. As it was in the days of Noah. In other words, as Jesus put it, just as it was in the time of the ark. For many years, Noah and his family were building that ark, and people could look and see it. Noah was a preacher of righteousness, we are told. But Noah's call was unheeded by all except his own family. This is not a vessel that you're going to use for little water skiing on the lake. This was a vessel that was specifically designed to preserve all life, at least all life that couldn't swim in the seas. Noah was told to do this, and Jesus says, verse 38, "For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." And it's for that reason Jesus warns us to be alert and awake and aware of his second coming, because it will be a time of judgment upon the world. For believers, It will be the time of our deliverance.
Thanks so much for listening to Awake Us Now with Pastor Chris Dodge. Today's program was sponsored by Awake Us Now. We encourage you to learn more about God at our website, awakeusnow.com. And please come back and join us again next time.